The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer. 4:30 in the morning at Oak Creek Memorial, and the emergency department was still breathing, monitors beeping in their asynchronous rhythm, the ventilator in Trauma Bay 2 wheeze clicking like a tired metronome, the automatic doors sliding open and closed for the graveyard shift's parade of broken bodies and fractured luck. Hannah Clarke moved through it all without making a sound. She was already 3 years into this life, 3 years of 12-hour shifts, of charting and vitals and medications counted out in milliliters and milligrams, 3 years of being the quiet presence that nobody quite noticed unless something went wrong, and even then, they forgot her name by the time the shift ended. That was exactly how she wanted it. Anonymous. Forgettable. Safe. The kind of safe that meant nobody asked questions about where she came from or why her hands moved the way they did when she was handling a patient, mechanically precise, economical, like someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion in a crisis could cost lives. She clocked in at 5:27 a.m., the badge reader beeping softly, and made her way to the locker room where the smell of industrial cleaning solution hung in the still air like a ghost. Her civilian jacket hung on the hook, and before she could think about it, before she could steel herself the way she always had to, her fingers found the seam. There. The unit patch, faded from 20 years of darkness and storage. Naval Special Warfare. The 2 words that had once meant everything, that had carved her into something that could survive things that should have killed her, and that she had deliberately buried when the nightmares became unbearable and she couldn't carry the weight of command anymore. She touched it once, just once, and then closed the locker door with a soft click. The ER was organized chaos at this hour. 3 trauma cases waiting for beds upstairs, a psychiatric hold pacing the security room, 2 elderly patients with chest pain who had probably just swallowed too much anxiety about their own mortality. Hannah moved between them with a kind of grace that came from muscle memory so deep it didn't require consciousness anymore. Vitals on room 4, blood pressure 156/92, heart rate elevated, O2 sat good at 97%. She documented everything with the precision of someone who understood that paperwork could save a life or end one, depending on how carefully you filled it out. Her hands were steady when she needed them to be. Inserting the 4 into the elderly man's papery vein required the kind of touch that came from having done it on soldiers in the field while explosions rattled your teeth, a slow breath, a quick insertion, a smooth glide into the vein. The man gasped, and she said, "You're all right. Just keep breathing," and something in her voice made him believe her, even though they both knew nothing was guaranteed. But when she was charting later, when she was alone in the corner of the break room with a lukewarm cup of coffee, her hands trembled. Just slightly. Just enough that she had to set the cup down and press her palms flat against the table until the shaking stopped. This was the part of the day she hated, the part where her body remembered what her mind tried to forget. That was when she heard the voice. Clarke. Not a greeting. A summons. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood in the doorway of the break room, his shoes, Italian leather, probably cost more than Hannah made in a week, clicking against the linoleum as he stepped inside. He was 63, silver-haired in a way that suggested expensive salon visits, with the kind of tan that came from skiing in Aspen and sailing off Coronado Island. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a medal, though Hannah had never actually seen him use it. "Morning, Dr. Hargrove," Hannah said. Her voice came out soft. Deferential. She straightened her posture but didn't stand, didn't make eye contact, just tilted her head slightly upward in what looked like respect but was actually a learned technique for remaining unthreatening. He studied her for a moment, the way someone studies an interesting organism under glass. His finger tapped against his tablet, which was displaying the shift log. She could see her name highlighted on the screen, though she couldn't see what the notation beside it said. "You're the one who asked pharmacy about the morphine discrepancies last week," he said. Not a question. Hannah's jaw tightened. Just for a moment. She controlled it. "I noticed the counts were off on 2 orders," she said carefully. "I wanted to make sure we weren't exposing anyone to liability. Hospital policy is to flag those through the supervisor," Hargrove said. His tone was pleasant. Almost friendly. That was the worst part about men like him, they could make casual cruelty sound like mentorship. not to initiate your own investigations. That's outside your scope. I apologize, Doctor. The words came out automatically, and she meant them, even though something in her chest, something old and scarred and trained by years of actual authority, wanted to argue. But arguing was a luxury for people who had nothing to lose, and she had carefully constructed a life where she had something to lose. A job. A studio apartment that cost too much. A routine that kept her from thinking about what she used to be. Hargrove smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Let's keep that in mind going forward, he said. Then he turned and left, the smell of his cologne lingering behind him like smoke. Hannah sat very still for a long moment. Then she stood up, poured the rest of her coffee down the sink, and went back to work. The morning staff meeting was held at 6:56 a.m. in the conference room, a beige-walled space with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like extras in a zombie film. Hannah sat in the back row, next to Marcus, the surgical tech who had been kind to her on her first day and had never stopped being kind, even when everyone else had learned that kindness toward Hannah Clarke was somehow suspicious. There were 12 of them around the table, nurses, techs, a physician's assistant, a resident, and Dr. Hargrove at the head. The meeting was the usual administrative theater. Bed capacity. Staffing updates. A reminder about documentation standards. And then, as if it had just occurred to him, Hargrove leaned back in his chair and said, "We've had some overeager nurses trying to do supervisory work lately. It's sweet, really, wanting to improve things. But it creates problems. Creates extra work for the people who are actually responsible for oversight. Creates the impression that we don't trust our management systems." He paused, looking around the table with that pleasant smile. "So let's respect the chain of command, shall we? There's a reason it exists." Nobody else seemed to notice the comment was targeted. Or if they did, they didn't care. But Hannah felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward in silence. She was staring at the table. She didn't move. Didn't change her breathing. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. When the meeting ended, people filed out in clusters, already talking about their patients and their breaks. Marcus paused beside her locker and said, "That was bullshit, what he did," but she just shook her head slightly and he let it go. He had learned too, in 3 years of knowing her, that some things didn't have words. By 7 o'clock, Hargrove was in his office on the 2nd floor, overlooking the ER. It was a good office, dark wood, expensive furniture, a view of downtown San Diego that cost more money than comfort. He closed the door and opened his computer, pulling up the file he'd been building on Hannah Clarke. Chart review activity. Pharmacy inquiries. Questions about supply chain billing. 3 years of notation flags, nothing overt, but a pattern. A pattern of a nurse who noticed things she shouldn't notice. A pattern of someone who might eventually ask the wrong questions about the wrong numbers. His phone buzzed. Text from his contact in the billing department, "She's asking questions about supply costs." Hargrove set the phone down and steepled his fingers. His system was beautiful, really, decades of carefully calculated phantom procedures, duplicate charges for imaging that had already been done, supplies requisitioned and never delivered but always paid for. The hospital was bleeding money in ways that nobody at the administrative level was sophisticated enough to notice, and he was the only one careful enough to ensure the bleeding flowed in the right direction. It had funded his beach house, his car collection, his daughter's wedding in Montecito. It had bought him the kind of power that came from knowing exactly which palms to grease and which favors to call in. But it required compliant people. People who didn't ask questions. People who understood that survival in a hospital meant staying in your lane. He opened her employee file and began to type. The medication room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like antiseptic and organized silence. Hannah stood at the cardiac station, pulling the chart for room for 12, a 73-year-old admitted with atrial fibrillation. She compared the physician's order to the EKG findings, her eyes tracking the dosage written in Hargrove's handwriting, digoxin 0.5 milligrams twice daily. The patient's ejection fraction was 42%. The dosage didn't match. For someone this fragile, this was a phantom prescription, a procedure that existed only in billing codes, never in the patient's actual treatment. Hannah flagged it for review, documented her concern in the system, and moved to the next chart. Small act. Quiet act. The kind of act that people with nothing to hide performed every shift. She didn't know Hargrove was watching the flagged report the moment it hit his system. Didn't know he was already making calculations. 2 hours later, the intercom crackled, "Nurse Clarke to room 347. Now." Not a request. A command. Hannah found Hargrove standing beside Marcus Chen's bed, where the veteran's wife sat holding their son's hand. Hargrove's face was already flushed. He held up Hannah's flag report between 2 fingers like it was contaminated. "This is the 3rd time this week you've questioned physician orders, Nurse Clarke. Are you a doctor now? Did I miss your medical degree?" His voice carried the particular edge of someone used to being obeyed. Hannah took one measured breath. "I was ensuring patient safety, doctor." Hargrove's shoulders tensed. "What you're ensuring is chaos. Stick to bedpans, clipboard. We have enough confusion without nurses playing detective." He turned to the family and smiled, the smile of a man who'd never been challenged in his life. "I apologize for the interruption. Your care is our top priority." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical wheeze. Hannah said nothing. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, then turned and left. But Hargrove wasn't finished. Not even close. He followed her into the hallway and posted a handwritten statement on the unit bulletin board, circling her name in red marker, Hannah Clarke, insubordination. Unauthorized chart reviews and questioning of physician judgment constitute a breach of professional boundaries. Formal counseling documented. Pattern noted. Other nurses began arriving for lunch shift. They read the board. They looked at Hannah. Then they looked away. The break room at noon felt like a hunting ground. Hannah unwrapped her sandwich at the table where she'd sat for 3 years, making small talk about call schedules and difficult families. Rodriguez grabbed her lunch mid-bite and left without a word. 2 others followed, their chairs scraping against linoleum. The message was clear: association with Hannah Clarke was contagion. Hargrove had marked her. Now the herd knew to distance themselves. Hannah sat alone with her sandwich, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing their mechanical drone, and when the tears came, just one, sliding down her cheek like she'd allowed it exactly once, she didn't look down. She wiped it with the back of her hand and took another bite. Her hands were perfectly steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. That afternoon, the phone in her pocket buzzed. A text from HR, meeting with Dr. Hargrove and myself. His office. 3 p.m. She arrived at 14:55, her uniform pristine, her jaw set at a precise angle. Hargrove sat with his hands folded, a folder open on his desk. Next to him was Patricia Kwan from Human Resources, her expression carefully neutral. "Hannah, we've been made aware of some concerns regarding your clinical judgment," Hargrove began. "Specifically, your pattern of questioning established protocols. This kind of behavior undermines departmental cohesion." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside was the flag report, her documented concern, and a form titled Counseling for Deficient Professional Judgment. "We're documenting this as a coaching conversation. You'll sign here acknowledging that you understand our expectations going forward." Hannah read every single word of the form slowly, deliberately. Then she picked up the pen and signed her full name in capital letters, Hannah Marie Clarke. Her signature was precise, military, unmarked by any tremor. When she looked up, her voice was steady as a surgeon's hand. "I've survived worse than embarrassment, doctor." Hargrove's face shifted, not quite rage, but something close to it. "I'm glad you understand the severity. We need team players here, not investigators." Hannah stood, buttoned her jacket, and left without another word. In the parking garage, she gripped the steering wheel of her 2014 Honda Civic, breathing in counts of 4, in through the nose, out through the mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4. Repeat. This was the technique she'd learned 20 years ago when her hands had to stay steady while holding a child pulled from Afghan rubble. The same technique that had kept her alive in Marja when everything around her was burning. She could survive a public humiliation. She could survive being marked by the herd. What she couldn't survive was the creeping certainty that her mistake, caring about patient safety, was about to cost her the only life she'd built after running from her old one. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1,400 hours, a man with a missing left leg and a face that looked like it had seen too much or too young arrived at Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department. Marcus Chen, 28 years old, accompanied by a friend who helped him from the car and guided him toward triage. His crutches moved with practiced efficiency, the muscle memory of someone who'd made peace with what he'd lost. The triage nurse logged him as minor chest pain, stable vitals, and assigned him to the waiting area. Marcus sat with his crutches leaning against the armrest, occasionally shifting his position, wincing slightly at the movement. His breathing was easy. His color was good. Nothing in his presentation suggested that in 6 hours, he would be gasping like a dying animal while the entire emergency department moved in slow motion around him. Hannah passed through the ER during a supply run, pushing a cart of linens toward the stockroom. She glanced at the waiting area, routine scan, the kind she did 15 times a shift, and her eyes caught on Marcus's face for exactly 0.3 seconds. Something flickered across her expression. A recognition. A confusion. She slowed her pace for half a step, then continued walking. She didn't know why the disabled veteran felt familiar. Didn't know that muscle memory sometimes lived in the unconscious mind, waiting decades to trigger. 2 minutes later, Hargrove intercepted her in the hallway outside Trauma Bay 2. "Clarke, I'm reassigning the ER overflow patients to Davis. You're on discharge paperwork today. Administrative duties only." His tone was pleasant. That's what made it worse. "Understood, doctor." She nodded once and turned toward the administrative office. Hargrove watched her go, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he walked to his office, closed the door, and picked up the phone. "First call, Bill, it's Mark Hargrove. Listen, I need you to trust me on a staffing issue. One of my nurses is showing signs of instability, chart flagging, questioning established procedures. I'm concerned about patient safety if we don't address this. I'd like your support on a termination initiative before anything escalates." Long pause. "I appreciate that. I'll have documentation by end of week." Hargrove hung up. Board Chairman Westbrook owed him favors from 3 orthopedic contracts. 1 phone call was enough. Second call, "Hi, this is Dr. Hargrove at Oak Creek Memorial in San Diego, calling about a former employee of yours. Hannah Marie Clarke? I'm conducting a reference check in connection with a current performance evaluation. Any concerns about stability during her tenure with you?" The voice on the other end was careful, professional. No formal complaints. "Why do you ask?" "Just due diligence," Hargrove said. "We've had some concerning behavioral patterns emerge." He hung up before the administrator could ask follow-up questions. The seed was planted. References were fragile things. Third call, "Yes, this is Dr. Mark Hargrove. I need to schedule a consultation with your risk management division regarding potential staff disciplinary action. I need documentation for a termination case, someone showing pattern behavior consistent with professional boundary violations. Can someone review this by Friday?" The consultant's voice was all business. "We can have preliminary recommendations by end of business Thursday. Send me the file." Hargrove typed the email immediately, attaching the flag reports, the board post, the HR counseling form. An entire narrative of insubordination, constructed in 72 hours. He reviewed the security footage of Hannah's movements throughout the shift, making notes, 08 for 7, medication room, extended time at cardiac station. 0920, flagged report submitted. 1000, pulled into room 347. 1015, observed fleeing confrontation. 1147, in break room, abandoned after colleagues arrived. The pattern was there if you looked for it the right way. Instability. Poor judgment. A liability. In the waiting room, Marcus shifted his weight forward, one hand pressing against his chest. His breathing began to labor slightly. Just fatigue. Just the phantom pain that came with amputation, the signals still firing from nerves that no longer existed. His friend had gone to move the car from the emergency zone. Marcus sat alone with his crutches, watching other patients cycle through triage faster than him, their acute presentations taking priority over a young man with minor chest pain and stable vital signs. The clock read 1600. Then 1700. Then 1800. Hannah finished the last discharge paperwork at 1835, her fingers moving through the forms with the rhythm of muscle memory. She glanced at the ER tracking board, a habit from 3 years of actual nursing before her administrative exile. Marcus Chen, still waiting. Waiting for 6 hours now. She frowned. That wasn't right. Not for someone who'd made it past triage. She stood and walked toward the ER entrance, peering through the glass doors into the waiting area. Marcus was still there. His head was tilted back against the wall now. His breathing looked different. Faster. His trachea visibly shifted to the left, the subtle movement of air trapping where it had no exit. His lips were taking on a dusky tone, the color of oxygen starvation. And nobody was checking on him. Nobody was even looking in his direction. The waiting room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like stale coffee and antiseptic, the kind of place where time moved differently, where 60 minutes felt like 3. Marcus Chen sat in the mold plastic chair, his prosthetic leg extended awkwardly, the socket already chafing against the residual limb below his left knee. His friend Dakota sat beside him, scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing at the clipboard triage had handed them at 1400 hours. Marcus had been checked in. Vitals recorded. Assigned to waiting area B, the lower priority zone where the billing codes didn't justify urgent care protocols. 1 hour passed. Then 2. The television mounted on the wall played an old news broadcast nobody was watching. Marcus shifted his weight, his good leg bouncing slightly, a nervous habit from his time at Fort Liberty, back when his body responded to his commands. His breathing seemed shallow today, like his lungs weren't quite filling. He'd mentioned it to the triage nurse. She'd noted it on the chart. Dr. Hargrove would see him soon. By hour 3, the waiting room had cycled through 3 different sets of patients. Some left healed. Some left still broken. Marcus remained. His hand occasionally drifted to his chest, pressing against the strange tightness there. Nothing alarming. Just the body's way of reminding him he'd survived an IED blast that obliterated his leg and did things to his insides that the VA doctors said were consistent with blast trauma. He'd learned to live with the tightness. Usually it passed. But not today. Hour 4. Hour 5. The charge nurse called names across the waiting room, and each time Hannah Clarke heard her voice deliver another patient to the treatment bays, she felt a small measure of relief that it wasn't Marcus. Though she couldn't say why she was tracking him at all. She was in the medication room restocking 12-lead EKG supplies when she first saw him, a young man with dark hair and the particular posture of someone missing a limb, moving the way military amputees moved, with the unconscious precision of someone who'd relearned their body's geometry. Something in his face struck her. The line of his jaw. The eyes that carried the peculiar exhaustion of soldiers who'd traded their wholeness for a cause they still believed in. She'd paused. Held a stack of electrode packets against her chest. Felt something old and buried shift inside her ribcage like a tectonic plate moving after decades of stillness. Then she'd forced herself to turn away. Professional distance. That was the rule. That was the only rule that kept her breathing. But she found herself returning to the doorway twice more, stealing glances at the waiting room. He was still there. Still waiting. His friend was asleep now, head tilted back against the wall. Marcus was alone with whatever was tightening in his chest. Dr. Hargrove's pager vibrated at 1,745 hours. Not from the ER. From administration. The message was terse: report to risk management immediately regarding billing compliance inquiry. He'd been waiting for this call since Hannah Clarke began her unauthorized chart reviews. He stood from the physician's lounge where he'd been reviewing billing worksheets, smoothed his starched white coat, and walked toward the elevator with the measured confidence of a man who'd built a system impervious to challenge. His network was solid. The hospital chairman owed him favors. Risk management consultants were expensive, and they always sided with doctors. Hannah Clarke was an obstacle being removed, and the visit to administration was simply paperwork. What he did not know was that Marcus Chen, the young veteran sitting unattended in waiting area B, had stopped shifting his weight 30 minutes ago. What he did not know was that breath had become a precision problem, shallow, rapid, desperate. What he did not know was that a tension pneumothorax was building in Marcus's left thoracic cavity, pressure accumulating with each failed breath, compressing the lung, collapsing the heart's ability to fill. Hannah felt it before she knew it. A pull. An instinct that belonged to a different life, a life where she'd been taught to read a battlefield and know where death was arriving before anyone else could hear it coming. She was in the supply room charting notes when the sensation crystallized into something urgent. She put down her pen. Walked toward the waiting room without permission, without announcement, without the careful deference that had kept her invisible for 3 years. Marcus was sitting exactly where he'd been sitting 6 hours ago. But his face had changed. The color had shifted from tan to something closer to ash. His hand was pressed against his left chest wall, fingers splayed, as if he could hold something inside by sheer force of will. And his breathing, God, his breathing was barely there. It looked like drowning on dry land. Hannah moved closer. She didn't run. Running would alert Hargrove's allies at the nurse's station. She simply walked, the way she'd once walked through compounds in Helmand Province, moving through space as if she belonged there absolutely. When she was close enough, she knelt beside Marcus's chair, her knees touching the linoleum floor with a soft sound like a prayer. Marcus Chen. Her voice was quiet. No inflection. Professional. He turned his head. Met her eyes. And something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or the drowning man's gratitude that someone had finally noticed. I can't breathe right. I know. She placed 2 fingers against his neck, finding the carotid pulse. Elevated. I'm a nurse. I need to check something. Her hands moved to his chest, feeling the outline of his ribs through his shirt. There. A shift in the trachea, a subtle deviation from midline that screamed pneumothorax. The clinical term didn't match the urgency. A lung had collapsed. Air was building in the space around it. Pressure was rising. Physics was killing him. Waiting room nurse to charge station. We have a patient in waiting area B experiencing acute respiratory distress. Tension pneumothorax protocol. She said it into thin air, knowing the intercom would catch it. The charge nurse appeared at the doorway 30 seconds later. Dr. Hargrove said all waiting room patients go through him. Where is he? Administration. I paged him. He didn't respond. Hannah stood. Then page him again. Code blue in waiting area B, respiratory failure, patient requires emergency decompression. The words moved like commands, like something from a rank that didn't officially exist in this building. The charge nurse picked up the phone immediately. Dialed. Waited. Look back at Hannah. No response. What do you want me to do? Hannah looked at Marcus. His face had gone the color of old concrete. His hand had fallen from his chest. His breathing was almost nothing now, a desperate flutter, like a bird dying in a closed room. I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol swabs, and a trauma bay. Get them now. It wasn't a request. The tone had shifted. The voice had dropped an octave. It carried the particular authority of someone who'd commanded people in circumstances where getting it wrong meant body bags. The charge nurse didn't hesitate. She moved. Marcus's eyes were rolling slightly, the oxygen deprivation beginning its work on his consciousness. Hannah positioned him, tilting his body for access. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark she'd learned in a different century, in a different uniform, in a desert where she'd saved people with nothing but training and hands that refused to fail. "I've got you," she said, and meant it in a way that transcended hospital protocol or job title or the 6 hours of institutional negligence that had brought them to this moment. "I'm a nurse. I've done this before. A lot." She didn't specify where. She didn't mention Marja, where she'd performed field surgery on soldiers with no anesthesia except the kind born from necessity. She prepped the site with the alcohol swab, her hands moving like they'd always moved in crisis, steady as surgical instruments, calm as someone who'd learned that fear was just data, just information her body was trying to give her about the stakes. The needle was ready. The trauma bay was being prepped behind the curtain. She could hear the sounds of activity accelerating, bottles clinking, monitors being activated, the peculiar orchestrated chaos of an emergency coming online. She didn't wait for Dr. Hargrove. The trachea shifted like a compass needle pointing toward death. Hannah saw it the moment she rounded the corner into the waiting room, Marcus Chen's chest heaving, his neck distended, the skin above his collarbone sucking inward with each desperate breath. 6 hours. The young veteran had been deteriorating in that plastic chair for 6 hours while administrative meetings consumed attention and protocols moved at the speed of bureaucracy. His lips were dusky blue. Hannah moved without hesitation, muscle memory overriding procedure. She'd seen this exact presentation before, in a dusty forward operating base where a truck driver took shrapnel through the chest cavity and the air that should have stayed inside decided to escape into the space between lung and ribs, compressing everything, suffocating from the inside out. Tension pneumothorax didn't wait for authorization. Tension pneumothorax killed you in minutes. An overhead page crackled through the ER speakers. "Nurse Clarke, report to administration immediately." She didn't break stride. Didn't even acknowledge the summons. Her jaw tightened once, a single involuntary muscle contraction, and then her face reset to absolute neutrality. The page repeated. She was already moving toward the supply cart, her hands reaching for the equipment with the precision of someone who had performed this procedure under fire, with incoming rounds rattling windows and the smell of cordite mixing with blood and antiseptic. A 14-gauge needle. Large bore. No time for anything smaller. Marcus's eyes locked onto hers as she knelt beside his chair. Recognition flickered there, not of who she was, but of what she was. Someone who knew. Someone who could help. "This is going to hurt," Hannah said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "But you'll live." She palpated his ribs, counting the intercostal spaces with her fingertips. Second rib. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were written into her muscle memory from 20 years ago, muscle memory that never fully retired, just waited in the basement of her nervous system for the moment it would be needed. The needle went in at a precise angle, pushing through skin, through the fascia, through the membrane of the pleural cavity. The hiss came like a tire deflating, like pressure finally releasing, like a breath the world had been holding for 6 hours. Marcus's chest expanded visibly. The color in his lips shifted from dusky purple to pink in the time it took for 3 heartbeats. His breathing deepened, became less frantic, less like a drowning man gasping for air at the surface. "That's better," Hannah whispered. The waiting room had gone dead silent. A mother holding a coughing child stared. An elderly man with a bandaged hand froze mid-reach for a magazine. A security guard reached for his radio but didn't key it, uncertainty written across his face. This was a nurse. Just a nurse. But her hands moved with the authority of someone far beyond the scope of her badge. The 911 paramedics arrived 90 seconds later, summoned by another staff member who'd finally processed what they were witnessing. They took one look at the needle decompression, one look at Marcus's stabilizing vitals, one look at Hannah's position beside him, and moved with the fluid efficiency of professionals who recognized a peer. No questions. No confusion. They transitioned him to their care, loaded him onto their stretcher, radioed ahead to trauma center. One of them, a stocky paramedic with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, caught Hannah's eye as they wheeled Marcus toward the ambulance. "You saved his life," he said. Hannah nodded once. A single dip of her chin. No elaboration. No modesty. No false humility. She simply turned away and began disposing of the needle and wrapper, her movements returning to the practiced efficiency of routine emergency room cleanup, as if she had merely stabilized a patient instead of performing a procedure that belonged in operating rooms with physician supervision and anesthesia teams and all the institutional weight of protocol. That's when the silence that followed was worse than any sound. Dr. Hargrove stood in the waiting room doorway, his face the color of old concrete, his eyes fixed on Hannah with an intensity that made the fluorescent light seem dim by comparison. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just observed, processing what he'd witnessed, calculating what it meant for the narrative he'd constructed over the past 24 hours. The page came again. Dr. Hargrove to administration. He ignored it entirely. Instead, he walked straight to Hannah, his voice dropping to a register that carried across the entire waiting room despite being pitched just above a whisper. "My office. Now." Hannah finished disposing of the medical waste. She removed her gloves with deliberate care, one pinch at the wrist, turning each inside out as they came off. Only then did she turn to face him. She didn't approach. Didn't follow. Just waited, her hands folded in front of her, her posture unchanged by his command. Hargrove's jaw tightened. For just an instant, the mask slipped, the calculation of how to proceed when your authority was being questioned in front of witnesses. Then he turned and walked toward his office, expecting her to follow. She did. His office was decorated in the language of success, mahogany desk, a diploma from Johns Hopkins, framed photographs of him golfing with hospital board members. A leather chair that cost more than Hannah made in a month. But his hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the desk, and his voice carried a tremor that suggested his world had suddenly become unstable. "You performed a surgical procedure without physician authorization." He spoke each word with deliberate precision, building a case brick by brick. "That is grounds for immediate termination of employment and mandatory review of your nursing license by the state board." Hannah remained standing. The worn combat jacket hung over her arm, the unit patch hidden beneath the lining, invisible but present, like everything else she carried that no one knew to look for. "He would have died waiting for authorization," Hannah said. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't plead. Just stated the fact as plainly as if she were reading vitals. "Tension pneumothorax kills in minutes. The paramedic said so himself. That's not your determination to make, clipboard." The old nickname, sharp as a knife blade. "You are a registered nurse. You follow orders. You don't make battlefield decisions in my emergency room." The phrase hung there. Battlefield decisions. As if he'd meant to say something else and stopped himself, but the slip revealed everything. He knew something was different about her, something military in her response, something that transcended the boundaries of her job description. Hannah felt her composure shift, just slightly, like the angle of a gun sight adjusting for wind. She didn't let him see it. But it was there. "You're suspended effective immediately," Hargrove continued, pulling his phone toward him with fingers that still trembled. "Security will escort you from the building. Your badge will be deactivated before you reach the parking lot." He dialed. "I need an escort to remove Nurse Clarke from the building. Now." 30 seconds. That's all it took for security to arrive, a guard named Patterson who'd seen Hannah in the ER 3 times a week for the past 3 years, who'd nodded to her in hallways, who now couldn't meet her eyes as he walked her toward the employee lockers. The walk through the ER felt like moving through a tomb. Nurses who'd once welcomed her in the break room turned away. A respiratory therapist she'd mentored suddenly found something urgent requiring her attention in the supply room. The isolation was complete, surgical in its precision. Hargrove had done his work well. Hannah opened her locker, third one from the left, third shelf down. Her extra pair of shoes. A half-empty bottle of ibuprofen. The worn combat jacket with the Navy Special Warfare patch sewn into the lining, the stitching done by her own hands 20 years ago with thread she'd unraveled from a uniform that no longer fit into her civilian life. She took the jacket and held it against her chest like armor. Patterson walked her through the ER toward the exit, past the waiting room where Marcus had been dying, where nobody had checked on him, where protocol and physician availability had mattered more than the young man's deteriorating oxygen levels. The plastic chair where he'd spent 6 hours sat empty now, a cup of cold coffee abandoned on the adjacent seat. Hannah walked past it without slowing. 2 days passed in the kind of silence that comes after amputation, after something essential has been removed and the body hasn't yet adjusted to the absence. She didn't check her phone. Didn't call the nursing board. Didn't contact a lawyer or a union representative. Instead, she sat in her apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant on El Cajun Boulevard and stared at the jacket, at the patch beneath the lining, at the evidence of the person she used to be before she became the person she was now. On the morning of the third day, she walked into the San Diego VA hospital in Hillcrest. The waiting room smelled like coffee and disinfectant and the particular exhaustion that comes from bodies that have been through more than bodies should endure. Veterans in various stages of healing occupied the chairs, some with prosthetics, some with visible scars, some with the invisible wounds that showed only in their eyes. An older man in a wheelchair, his left leg ending just below the knee, looked at the way Hannah moved and offered a nod of recognition. "You serve?" he asked. Hannah nodded but didn't elaborate. She'd learned long ago that stories consumed oxygen, and she had none left to spare. She filled out her intake forms in the waiting area, her hand pausing over the question about previous military service. She wrote Navy and nothing else. The combat jacket rested on her lap, her thumb tracing the invisible outline of the patch through the lining, worn cloth beneath worn cloth, layers of concealment. The intake coordinator called her name. Hannah Clarke. She stood, the jacket clutched in both hands, and walked toward the appointment that would require her to speak about the dust of Marja, about the sounds of incoming fire, about the 8-year-old boy's hand in hers as she pulled him from rubble. The appointment she'd been running from for 20 years. But before she could reach the door, a nurse emerged from the back of the waiting room, a woman with captain's bars on her navy dress uniform, her face carrying the particular intensity of someone trained to lead men into darkness. Jessica Chen. She walked directly to Hannah, her eyes widening with recognition, and spoke 4 words that changed everything. "You're Phantom, aren't you? You're Phantom, aren't you?" The words hung in the ICU conference room like a surgical blade suspended mid-air. Hannah's hand froze on the jacket fabric. Her jaw tightened. Not a visible flinch, not a tremor, just the smallest contraction of muscle beneath skin, the kind of restraint that only comes from having already survived the worst. Jessica Chen stood in the doorway in dress blues, her commander's rank insignia catching the fluorescent light, her eyes locked on Hannah with the certainty of someone who'd spent 20 years searching without knowing exactly what she was searching for. Behind Jessica, the room had transformed. FBI agents in dark windbreakers. Hospital board members with expressions ranging from shock to nausea. Marcus Chen, sitting upright in the ICU bed now, his color returned, his lungs finally pulling oxygen like they remembered how. And in the far corner, Rodriguez, the IT administrator, sat with a laptop open, his marine tattoo visible where his shirt sleeve had rolled up. Hannah breathed once. Twice. Then she nodded. Not admission. Acknowledgement. There was a difference. "Come with me," Jessica said. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. They walked to the conference room adjacent to the ICU, and the moment the door closed, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, his phone already in his hand. He'd been making calls for the last 4 hours, to Chairman Westbrook, who owed him favors from a golf trip to Scottsdale where certain financial arrangements had been discussed, to Hannah's previous hospital administrator in Los Angeles, where Hargrove had planted seeds with the precision of someone spreading poison in a garden. Unstable, he'd said. Made some questionable clinical decisions. Might benefit from psychiatric evaluation before she practices again. Not a lie. A suggestion. A shadow without substance. Enough to taint a reference without exposing himself. But that wasn't the worst part. The FBI agent who now sat across from Hargrove, Special Agent Martinez, 15 years in white-collar crime investigation, had already opened a folder that made Hargrove's face drain of color like water from a bathtub. Rodriguez stood beside her, laptop screen angled upward, his voice steady as concrete. Dr. Hargrove tried to delete security footage from the last 72 hours, Rodriguez began, his fingers moving across the trackpad with the confidence of someone who'd spent 6 years maintaining military networks. I save redundant backups of everything. This is standard. This is required. He pressed play, and the screen filled with timestamp and image, Marcus Chen arriving at Oak Creek Memorial at 1,400 hours on a stretcher, wheeled past Dr. Hargrove in the waiting area at 1,403 hours, 1,547 hours, and again at 1,823 hours. 6 hours. Hargrove walking past the disabled veteran 3 times without stopping. Without checking. Without ordering labs or imaging or even a basic triage assessment. Hargrove's voice came out thin. He was stable when he arrived. Triage noted. Triage noted nothing, Martinez interrupted, sliding a printout across the table. Because no one performed triage. Nurse Clarke was the first person to properly assess this patient, and she did so after 6 hours of being ignored. After his trachea had shifted for millimeters to the left. After his O2 saturation had dropped to 67%. Rodriguez continued the video. Hargrove at 2,100 hours, accessing the security system from his office. His fingers on the keyboard, reflected in the dark office window like a ghost made of evidence. Deleting files. Timestamps. Footage from the waiting area simply ceasing to exist in the hospital system, erased as if Marcus Chen had never arrived at all. You tried to erase him, Rodriguez said quietly. A Marine doesn't forget things like that. The FBI agent pulled another folder from her briefcase. We've been investigating Oak Creek Memorial's billing irregularities for 6 months. 6 months of phantom procedures, duplicate charges, imaging ordered twice and billed 3 times. Dr. Hargrove, your name appears on 347 fraudulent claims totaling $2.3 million. She paused, letting the number settle like sediment. That's not a mistake. That's systematic. Board Chairman Westbrook, who'd been sitting with his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white, stood abruptly. I had no knowledge of these charges. None whatsoever. I'll cooperate fully with your investigation. Your phone records show 15 calls with Dr. Hargrove in the last week, Martinez said. Including one at 18:15 hours on the date of Nurse Clarke's suspension. 2 hours before her security badge was deactivated. Would you like to tell me what that conversation was about? Westbrook sat down like his legs had been cut from under him. The hospital security chief entered with 2 more agents. One produced a document that made Hargrove's hands begin to shake, not the tremor of conscience, but of a man watching his entire constructed world collapse into rubble. Within 60 minutes, his credentials would be suspended. Within 2 hours, his security badge deactivated, hospital privileges revoked, office emptied by a neutral third party to prevent tampering. The escort from the building would take 17 minutes. Staff would line the hallway in absolute silence as he passed, his face a mask of disbelief, his lawyer's hand on his elbow the only thing keeping him moving forward. But Hannah didn't wait to see that. She walked to the ICU window and stood facing San Diego's lights stretching across the darkness like scattered diamonds, the city breathing below her, indifferent to everything that had just happened in this one small room. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving the glass clean, leaving everything visible. Jessica Chen appeared beside her. Not touching. Not needing to. Just standing in the kind of silence that warriors understand, the silence that comes after battle, when words are too small for what needs to be said. "The Navy would take you back tomorrow," Jessica said finally. "With your rank, your record. Full reinstatement. Benefits. Pension acceleration. All of it." Hannah's reflection in the glass showed a woman who'd spent 20 years trying to become invisible. The uniform patch sewn inside her jacket was the only thing tying her to who she'd been. The only proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke, call sign Phantom, had once pulled a terrified 8-year-old boy from the rubble of a compound in Marja, held him while the medevac came, whispered in his ear that he was going to live, that he was going to be okay. "I can't go back," Hannah said quietly. "Not to that. The military saved my life and then it nearly destroyed me. The PTSD, the nightmares, the way I couldn't sleep without checking exits and counting personnel, I chose to step away because staying would have killed me." She turned to look at Jessica directly. "I walked away from the military when PTSD became unbearable. I chose anonymity to heal. No one in my family knows where I am." "I found you," Jessica said. "You found Marcus. I was just the nurse who happened to be working when he got sick." But they both knew that wasn't true. They both knew that it was never coincidence when two threads of the same fabric ended up woven back together. Marcus's voice came from behind them, thin but steady. "You saved me twice." He was standing in the doorway, still in his hospital gown, still holding the force stand, his body still learning how to exist with one leg. "Once when I was 8. Once tonight." "How do you do that? How do you keep saving the same person over and over?" Hannah turned to him. "Measured breath. Composed. Training," she said simply. "And muscle memory." Dr. Hargrove was being led out of the building by that moment, his hands cuffed, his lawyer making frantic phone calls that would ultimately matter very little. The federal investigation into Oak Creek Memorial's billing practices would expand to include 3 other administrators and result in the conviction of 5 people across the hospital system. Westbrook would negotiate a plea agreement involving cooperation with federal prosecutors and a $400,000 fine, but his career in hospital administration was finished. No one would hire him again once news of the investigation became public. The hospital's new CEO, a cardiac surgeon named Dr. Patricia Okafor with 15 years of clinical experience and zero tolerance for administrative fraud, would implement new billing oversight protocols within a week. But Hannah didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that she was standing in a hospital ICU window at 2,247 hours on a Tuesday night, looking out at a city that had no idea how close it had come to losing a young man who would have spent the rest of his life wondering why no one had helped him. The rain had washed the glass clean. Everything was visible now. Everything was exposed. 1 year later, Marcus Chen walked into a community college classroom in San Diego wearing a new prosthetic leg. His gait was confident now, his strength rebuilt through months of physical therapy, his mind focused on a future that had nearly been erased. At the front of the room, Dr. Hargrove stood in a polo shirt, the polo shirt of a man teaching CPR certification for minimum wage as part of his plea agreement. His medical license was gone. His career was ash. The classroom smelled like antiseptic and new textbook pages, and when Hargrove's eyes found Marcus in the front row, his hands began to shake. Marcus wore a faded Naval Special Warfare Unit patch on his jacket. The same patch Jessica had given him. The same patch Hannah had tucked into his 8-year-old hand 20 years ago in the dust of Afghanistan, a promise that someone would remember his name. "Dr. Hargrove," Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades and a second chance, "I'm here to recertify my CPR. I volunteer at the VA hospital now." Hargrove's voice cracked as he began the lesson. The classroom had gone absolutely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the ventilation system humming overhead and the faint echo of what justice sounds like when it finally arrives. At Oak Creek Memorial, Hannah Clarke stood in the emergency department wearing a new badge, a nurse educator. Her hands no longer hesitated. Her voice no longer deferred. She was training a group of new nursing hires on proper triage assessment, on the importance of double-checking orders, on the consequences of silence when you witness corruption. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in sharp relief. Her military bearing was evident in every movement. This was who she'd been underneath the invisibility. This was who she'd always been. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you've ever watched the system protect the guilty instead of the innocent, if you've ever wondered what happens to those who stand alone against corruption, subscribe now. Like this video. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Hannah's position?